Every farmer in Ellis County thought Raymond Dodd was crazy. In the brutal summer of 1994, he carried the kind of thin, cutting frost that settled deep into a man's knuckles long before the sun cleared the horizon. By 8 o'clock on that Thursday morning in 1994, the gravel lot at Callaway Equipment was already packed tight with pickup trucks, their exhaust pipes pluming white against the cold Kansas sky. Men who ought to have been grease-deep in their own maintenance shed stood shoulder to shoulder along the chain-link fence, hands buried in canvas coat pockets, boots kicking at the frozen dirt. They had not driven in from 3 surrounding townships for a hardware clearance or a free mug of black coffee. They were there because word had traveled through the county co-op that the regional desk from Wichita was coming to town. In Ellis County, 6 years after the farm debt crisis had wrecked half the operations between Hays and the Oklahoma line, a regional sales representative did not show up just to shake hands. Margins had thinned out to a razor edge. A man could work 12-hour shifts through planting, hit his fertility targets, hit his rainfall windows, and still find himself sitting at the kitchen table in November with a yellow legal pad, realizing that a single bad equipment note had eaten his entire net operating margin. Gary Whitfield understood that arithmetic and he used it like a precision tool. Standing beside a pristine company Ford with low-profile tires, Whitfield looked like he had never cleared a clogged cultivator shaft in his life. His green and yellow dealer jacket was spotless, the embroidered emblem sitting flat against his chest, and his leather boots had never touched standing mud in a low terrace. Beside him, mounted on fresh rubber that smelled of raw chemical sulfur, sat a massive John Deere 8760 articulated four-wheel drive. Its 425 horsepower turbocharged diesel engine towered over the crowd, a green mountain of capital investment with a price tag designed to separate surviving farms from thriving ones. Standing near the edge of the crowd, 52-year-old Raymond Dodd wiped a smudge of oil off his palm with an old red rag. Raymond farmed 1,300 acres of tight, unforgiving wheat land southeast of Hays. He wasn't looking at the big articulated rig's chrome stack or its dual tires. He was watching Whitfield's hands as the salesman reached into the cab and pulled out a heavy vinyl display binder. Whitfield didn't just sell iron. He sold the anxiety of falling behind. With a smooth, practiced turn of his wrist, Whitfield unrolled a laminated 6-foot performance comparison chart and pinned it to the side of the tractor's frame, its bold black graphics explicitly laying out the alleged engineering failures of every competing machine operating in the High Plains. The chart caught the sharp morning light, its bold columns laid out with the cold precision of a bank audit. Gary Whitfield stepped up to the vinyl poster, a thin silver pointer appearing in his hand as he tapped the top margin. He ran through the baseline metrics first, horsepower curves, displacement ratios, hydraulic pump outputs, presenting the numbers with the easy confidence of a man delivering undeniable truth. The gathered farmers stood silent, their breathing fogging in the crisp air as Whitfield maneuvered down the page toward a section highlighted in yellow ink titled Field Efficiency Rating. That column was not a measurement of engine displacement or axle thickness. It was a calculated formula built on corporate assumptions, designed to convert raw draft capacity into projected financial loss. Whitfield's pointer paused precisely halfway down the list, settling on a line that read Massey Ferguson 3690. The chart accurately listed the machine's 145 horsepower rating and its turbocharged 6-cylinder displacement. But in the efficiency column, the numbers dropped precipitously, assigning the red tractor a penalty score that suggested severe power loss under heavy tillage. Whitfield turned to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly over the idling pickup engines. He explained, with a patronizing tilt of his head, that while the 3690 was a capable utility unit for lighter acreage or secondary tillage, running it against heavy High Plains draft loads was an exercise in systematic money loss. He spoke of early torque degradation, internal power transfer drag and excessive wheel slip, failures that he claimed quietly drained fuel tanks and shortened critical planting windows. As Whitfield delivered his analysis, 2 farmers near the front turned their heads slightly, glancing back toward the fence line where Raymond Dodd stood. Raymond's expression did not shift. His 1991 Massey Ferguson 3690 was currently sitting back in his shop, grease-checked and ready for spring field preparation. He had paid $61,000 for that machine 3 years ago, taking on a 5-year note that forced him to cut his family's personal spending down to the bare bone. The tractor was not an articulated 4-wheel drive powerhouse, but its turbocharged engine had pulled every implement he owned through heavy, sun-baked clay without a single mechanical refusal. Raymond tucked his red rag into his back pocket, shifted his weight forward, and cleared his throat, his voice cutting flat and low across the quiet gravel lot as he asked Whitfield exactly what physical draft variables had been programmed into those chart calculations. Gary Whitfield blinked, his silver pointer hovering over the vinyl chart as 31 pairs of mud-caked work boots shifted against the gravel. He smoothed the lapel of his green dealer jacket, offering the crowd a professional, calibrated smile. He answered that the efficiency figures were derived from standard industry testing protocols, a controlled draft environment designed to replicate typical Midwestern field conditions. Raymond stepped away from the chain-link fence, his hands remaining steady in his coat pockets. He asked what load Whitfield's standard protocol called for. Whitfield paused, glancing back at the fine print at the bottom of his poster, before stating that the testing baseline utilized a 12-bottom plow working at an 8-inch depth in typical plains soil at 4 miles per hour. Raymond nodded slowly, the motion deliberate and unhurried. He told the salesman that the soil southeast of Hayes wasn't typical Midwestern dirt, it was sun-baked Ellis County hard pan. He stated flatly that he ran a 14-bottom moldboard plow pulled at 9 inches deep through 43 acres of that exact ground every single spring, and he wanted to know what Whitfield's chart said about a Massey Ferguson 3690 under those exact operating conditions. The silence that settled over the Callaway equipment lot was heavy and complete. Whitfield cleared his throat, his posture tightening as he admitted that the chart was designed around standard comparative baselines, but added that he would be glad to request specialized technical documentation from the engineering team in Des Moines to address non-standard draft specifications. Raymond looked the regional representative squarely in the eyes, told him he would appreciate reading whatever paper the corporate office cared to send, and turned on his heel. He walked across the gravel, climbed into his faded pickup truck, and started the engine. As Raymond pulled out of the dealership lot, the crowd of farmers watched his tailgate disappear down the road. Behind him, Whitfield attempted to pick up the thread of his presentation on the four-wheel drive 8760, but the air in the lot had changed. The polished theoretical numbers pinned to the tractor frame no longer felt like undeniable facts. They felt like paper math waiting to be tested against real ground. The gravel road back to the homestead was quiet, save for the steady hum of the tires against the dry washboard dirt. Pulling into the yard, Raymond let the pickup idle for a moment outside the machine shed. Through the wide sliding doors sat the Massey Ferguson 3690, its deep red paint dusted with a fine layer of Kansas silt. It wasn't an articulated giant that made people pull over on the county line to stare, but to Raymond, every square inch of its cast-iron frame carried the weight of real sacrifice. Back in the spring of 1991, signing the papers for $61,000 had felt like signing away his peace of mind. 5 years on a commercial agricultural note at 9% interest meant there was no room for error. It meant driving a farm truck with 200,000 miles on the odometer, postponing house repairs, and cutting personal expenses down to the bone. For 3 straight years, every spare dollar generated by the wheat harvest went straight to the bank in Hayes before it ever touched a personal savings account. What he bought with that sacrifice wasn't status, it was certainty. The 3690 was built around a 6-cylinder, 6-liter turbocharged Perkins engine that delivered a reliable 145 PTO horsepower. There were no digital display screens in the cab, no sensitive electro-hydraulic feedback systems to misread a heavy load, and no complex computer modules tucked under the hood. It was pure mechanical design, heavy steel gears, mechanical fuel injection, and a robust 3-point hitch built to handle high draft loads without complaining. Every night after supper, Raymond kept a strict ledger in his shop office, recording fluid hours, filter replacements, and grease intervals down to the exact date. He treated the machine not as a flashy asset, but as a working partner that held his family's economic survival in its crankcase. If that tractor went down during a critical fieldwork window, the interest payments wouldn't stop, but his income would. By the final week of April, nature closed in to test that thin margin. A sudden Arctic cold front swept down through the high plains, locking the topsoil in ice and delaying spring preparation by 11 crucial days. When the sun finally broke through, it brought a dry, baking heat that rapidly hardened the damp clay into a concrete-like crust, forcing Raymond to drop his implements into the toughest, most brutal ground of the entire season. The late spring heat hit Ellis County like an open oven door, rapidly baking the top 6 inches of rain-soaked clay into dense, pale hard pan. The 11 days lost to the April frost had squeezed the planting window down to a razor-thin margin, leaving no room for equipment failure or slow progress. In the yard behind the machine shed, Raymond backed the Massey Ferguson 3690 up to his 14-bottom moldboard plow. The heavy iron drawbar clanked into place as he dropped the hitch pin and secured the safety clip, the hydraulic hoses snapping into their couplings with a firm, pressurized click. This was the exact implement Gary Whitfield had claimed the red tractor couldn't handle. A massive heavy draft plow that demanded continuous, uninterrupted torque to slice through hardened high plains soil. Raymond climbed into the cab, checked his oil pressure gauge, and let the 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel engine warm up to its full operating temperature. The steady, deep thrum of the 6-liter power plant echoed off the tin walls of the shed, smooth and unhurried. Driving down the section lane toward his 43-acre east field, Raymond looked over the horizon. The ground looked completely unforgiving, cracked open under the midday sun and baked to the consistency of dried brick. Slicing through this earth at proper depth meant forcing thousands of pounds of steel through continuous mechanical resistance. He lined up the front right tire with the edge of the field, reached down to the hydraulic control levers and lowered the plow. The heavy steel moldboard shanks bit into the baked earth, sending a deep shudder through the tractor frame as 9 inches of dense hard pan were flipped over in thick, dark ribbons. Raymond set his throttle lever, settled the engine right into its power curve at 4.5 miles per hour, and kept his eyes fixed straight ahead down the fence line. Right across that shared wooden fence line, working the adjacent section of land, was his neighbor Glenn Paris. Glenn was sitting in the high-tech air-conditioned cab of a brand-new John Deere, fresh off the dealer lot and gleaming green under the harsh Kansas sun. Raymond tightened his grip on the wheel, maintained his engine speed, and watched the heavy red tractor pull straight into the hardest ground on the section. On the morning of May 6th, the boundary fence between the two properties looked like a living laboratory for mid-90s agricultural technology. On the north side of the wire, Glenn Paris was turning ground with a brand-new John Deere 7800, a machine he had taken on a fresh 5-year note just 2 weeks after the demonstration at Callaway Equipment. It was a slick, quiet tractor, outfitted with digital displays and an electro-hydraulic hitch system designed to automate draft compensation. Glenn had paired the new green tractor with a 10-bottom plow set to an 8-inch working depth, working his land with smooth, methodical passes. On the south side of the wire, Raymond Dodd ran his 1991 Massey Ferguson 3690, dragging 14 bottoms set at a full 9 inches into the hard pan. The difference in mechanical burden was plain to anyone standing near the access road. Raymond's machine was carrying 40% more moldboard iron through soil that had been baked an inch deeper by the heat, forcing its turbocharged 6-cylinder engine to work deep within its continuous torque reserve. As both tractors moved down their respective lines, the sound of the engines filled the open valley. The John Deere shifted its engine management under load, its electronic controls adjusting fuel flow in precise, computerized cycles. Across the fence, the Massey Ferguson emitted a steady, dark-throated roar, an uninterrupted mechanical hum that stayed at a flat 4.5 miles per hour without hunting for gears or burning excessive wheel traction. Raymond kept his left hand resting lightly on the mechanical draft lever, feeling the tactile vibrations of the hard pan through the floorboards as the shares sliced through the clay. Glenn had backed his farm budget into a corner to make the payments on that 7800, trusting Whitfield's efficiency charts to offset the heavy interest rate. Raymond, meanwhile, was working with a machine he had already paid down through 3 years of strict financial discipline. Neither man flagged the other down, and neither slowed at the headlands to talk. It was the unwritten rule of the high plains: you watched your neighbor's line out of respect, but you minded your own work. Right at 12 o'clock as the sun hit its zenith and Raymond completed his final southern pass along the fence, the steady diesel hum across the wire abruptly cut out, replaced by a strange, sudden silence. The green tractor stood motionless near the north headland, its 10-bottom plow suspended 3 feet in the air like a heavy iron ghost. Through the glare of the noon sun, Raymond could see Glenn Paris leaning over the right fender of the John Deere 7800, a heavy shop manual open on the hood as he stared down into the wiring harness. The machine's digital dash had thrown an electronic hitch fault code, locking the 3-point hydraulic control module into an automated safety lock. No matter how many times Glenn cycled the ignition key or pulled the cab levers, the computer refused to lower the implement back into working depth. In 1994, modern computerized sensors were supposed to protect a transmission from operator error, but on dry Kansas hard pan during a compressed planting window, a failed $50 position sensor was as devastating as a thrown rod. Glenn's tractor wasn't broken in its engine or its steel gears. It was sidelined by its own electronics. At 12:15, Glenn climbed down from the cab, pulled a mobile phone from his coat, and placed a call to the service department at Callaway Equipment. The answer from town was flat and uncompromising. Every field technician was already out on road service, and no one could reach his farm until 9 o'clock the following morning. Raymond reached the end of his southern pass, throttled down slightly, and swung the Massey Ferguson 3690 around in a wide, smooth arc. He looked across the fence wire at Glenn sitting on his toolbox in the dirt, staring at an idle machine while $30,000 of debt sat parked in the heat. Raymond didn't tap his horn, he didn't pull up to the fence to offer unsolicited advice, and he didn't indulge in a moment of satisfaction. On the high plains, taking pleasure in another man's mechanical breakdown was a quick way to invite bad luck onto your own acreage. Instead, Raymond adjusted his draft control lever, felt the 14 heavy moldboard shares bite back down into 9 inches of dense earth, and pushed the throttle back to 4.5 miles per hour. The mechanical linkage clicked firmly into place, unaffected by voltage drops or sensor logic. As the sun dipped below the western horizon and Glenn's field sat dark and quiet, the red tractor's headlights swept across the turned earth, its mechanical diesel engine running smoothly into the cool Kansas night. By dusk on May 7th, the last pass through the 43-acre east field was finished. The 14-bottom moldboard plow rose out of the dark, freshly turned soil with a smooth hydraulic sigh as Raymond swung the Massey Ferguson 3690 toward the farmyard. Across the fence, Glenn Paris's brand-new John Deere was finally moving again, its hitch sensor replaced after a full day and a half of wasted weather window. Raymond didn't linger to watch. He throttled down, drove into his machine shed, and let the turbocharged 6-cylinder engine idle for 5 minutes to cool the oil bearings before shutting it down. Inside his small, dust-dusted shop office, Raymond pulled a metal chair up to his steel desk. He opened a worn green ledger, the farm's maintenance and operational log, and uncapped his pen. He recorded the date, the exact engine hours, fuel consumption down to the gallon, and the acreage completed. Under the column labeled Unscheduled Repairs/Mechanical Downtime, he drew a firm, horizontal dash. 0 minutes. $0. The next morning at the Hayes Grain Co-op, 3 farmers were sitting on upturned grease buckets near the scale house, discussing Glenn's hitch trouble. When Raymond walked in to check fertilizer prices, one of them looked up and asked how the old red tractor had handled the east side hard pan. Raymond took off his cap, wiped his brow, and simply said it had finished the job on time. He offered no commentary on Gary Whitfield's chart, no jab at Glenn's delayed planting, and no grand claims about Massey Ferguson engineering. On the high plains, boasting was cheap. It was the logbook that held the only truth that mattered over a 10-year note. He drove back home, pulled up to the galvanized mailbox at the end of his driveway, and reached through the truck window. Among the utility bills and farm equipment circulars sat a heavy manila envelope bearing a corporate return address from Des Moines, Iowa. Tearing it open, Raymond found a 14-page technical document, the official engineering defense paper Gary Whitfield had promised at the demonstration, specifically compiled to explain why a Massey Ferguson 3690 could not efficiently pull a 14-bottom plow through hard pan. Late on a Tuesday night, with the house quiet and the clock above the stove ticking past 10, Raymond sat at the kitchen table under a single overhead bulb. Spread out beside a mug of lukewarm black coffee were 14 pages of high-grade corporate paper sent directly from the product engineering department in Des Moines. The document was meticulously organized, filled with multicolor graphs, fluid dynamic calculations, and complex logarithmic curves analyzing torque drop-offs and theoretical wheel slippage under high draft loads. In clean, authoritative prose, the corporate engineers laid out their case. According to their algorithmic modeling, running a 145 horsepower turbocharged engine against a 14-bottom moldboard plow at 9 inches depth should have induced an unacceptable 16% power transfer loss. The paper mathematically proved that the Massey Ferguson's mechanical transmission lacked the dynamic torque multiplication necessary to sustain efficiency, predicting elevated exhaust temperatures, excessive fuel consumption, and premature clutch wear. Every graph pointed to a single, mathematically sound conclusion. The machine on Raymond's farm was simply incapable of performing the work it had completed 3 days prior. Raymond turned the pages slowly, his calloused thumbs sliding over the precise ink lines. He didn't get angry and he didn't laugh. He recognized the work for what it was, a brilliantly constructed corporate self-justification, written by men who spent their days in climate-controlled offices running theoretical simulations on mainframe computers. The paper was technically flawless in every respect, except for the stubborn fact that 43 acres of turned, sun-baked clay were sitting outside his window, fully prepped for planting without a single extra drop of fuel burned or a degree of engine temperature spikes. He gathered the pages, tapped them neat against the Formica tabletop, and stood up. Walking into his shop office, he opened the dark gray filing cabinet where he kept his machine logbooks. He dropped the Des Moines Engineering white paper into a folder directly behind his routine grease interval sheets and oil sampling reports. It wasn't useful for farming, but it was documentation of a corporate mindset, and Raymond kept accurate records. As June turned into July, the mild spring evaporated completely. A brutal high plains drought settled over Ellis County, sending ambient temperatures soaring past 100 degrees and putting every tractor cooling system in the township to an extreme, unforgiving test. By August, the summer drought had locked Ellis County in a relentless heat wave, wilting the corn and driving wheat yields 12% below the county average. Soft commodity prices at the Kansas City board meant that every dollar budgeted in February had lost its cushion. At Raymond Dodd's homestead, survival meant running the operation with absolute precision. No wasted fuel, no ignored fluid checks, and zero tolerance for mechanical neglect. Inside his cool, dirt-floored shop, Raymond stuck strictly to his maintenance routine. Every 50 hours, the Massey Ferguson 3690 received fresh grease across all 24 fittings on its heavy front axle and three-point linkage. He swapped out the hydraulic filter, drew an oil sample for lab analysis, and checked the air intake elements with meticulous care. The six-cylinder Perkins turbo ran clean, showing no signs of thermal stress despite pulling row crop implements through triple-digit heat. His maintenance log recorded routine consumables, oil, filters, grease, and not a single dime spent on emergency repairs. Across the fence line, Glenn Paris was experiencing a very different summer with his new John Deere 7800. While the repairs were technically covered under dealer warranty, the operational friction was piling up. At the grain elevator, Glenn quietly listed the season's troubles. The hitch sensor that failed in May had shorted out again in July during a dusty cultivation pass. A high-pressure PTO shaft seal developed a steady hydraulic leak that required a full day in Callaway's shop, and an intermittent electronic fuel injection glitch required a 2-hour emergency road call from a dealership technician. Glenn wasn't complaining. Callaway equipment had responded quickly each time, but the hidden tax of lost field time was wearing on him. A free warranty repair didn't bring back an optimal soil moisture window once the sun had baked the field dry. Raymond listened respectfully at the elevator, offered no unsolicited critique, and drove back to his farm. A machine that stayed in the field was always cheaper than a machine that needed a fleet of service trucks to keep its warranty valid. Late on a Wednesday afternoon, as Raymond was blowing dust out of the Massey's radiator core with an air wand, an immaculate white company Ford pulled into the gravel yard. Gary Whitfield stepped out of the truck, carrying a fresh leather briefcase, and walked straight toward the open doors of the machine shed. Gary Whitfield stepped into the shade of the machine shed, his polished leather shoes crunching softly on the gravel floor. He adjusted the collar of his spotless corporate jacket, his eyes sweeping over the dirt-dusted red paint of the Massey Ferguson 3690. The tractor sat near the wide sliding doors, hot oil and warm metal radiating from its iron block after a long day in the field. Whitfield offered a controlled, professional smile, setting his leather briefcase down on an empty oil drum. He opened the conversation with polished ease, stating that he was following up on the technical documentation sent out from Des Moines back in June. He expressed hope that Raymond had reviewed the engineering white paper and was ready to discuss upgrading his operation to a machine capable of mitigating high draft torque loss. Raymond set his air wand down on the workbench, picked up his grease rag and slowly wiped his fingers. He looked Whitfield dead in the eye and said he had read every single page of the document. Whitfield's smile widened slightly as he leaned into his sales pitch, arguing that while the Massey might manage to pull heavy implements across a single season, the long-term data proved an efficiency gap. He explained that theoretical fuel degradation curves and subtle transmission slippage compounded over thousands of operating hours, representing thousands of dollars in lost operational margin. Raymond stood silent, letting the salesman finish his calculated presentation. He glanced back at the 3690, its mechanical fuel pump and simple cast iron housing unbothered by paper projections. He looked at Whitfield and stated flatly that he had run his 14-bottom moldboard plow through 43 acres of hard pan at 9 inches depth back in May. Whitfield paused, shifting his weight, and noted that completing a task did not disprove calculated fuel loss. Raymond reached for a clean shop towel, his voice dropping into a quiet, unyielding tone. He asked Whitfield if he knew the exact monthly note on a new John Deere 7800 financed over 5 years at current interest rates. Whitfield began to offer to pull an official price sheet from his briefcase, but Raymond cut him off cleanly. He said he didn't need a quote because his neighbor Glenn Paris farmed the section directly east of his fence line. He added that while Glenn had spent the summer dealing with 2 failed electronic hitch sensors, a blown PTO seal and 3 service truck visits, his own red tractor had not lost a single hour of field work. Whitfield's mouth tightened, the slick corporate defense vanishing in an instant. Standing inside a working farm shed surrounded by real dirt, real debt, and zero downtime, the theoretical efficiency charts held no ground. He picked up his briefcase, offered a brisk, silent nod, and drove out of the yard, leaving Raymond alone with the steady cooling creak of his iron engine. The white company Ford pulled out of the driveway, kicking up a thin trail of dust that hung in the late afternoon heat before settling onto the prairie grass. That Wednesday visit marked the last time Gary Whitfield ever set foot on Raymond Dodd's farm. Within 18 months, Whitfield transferred out of the Pratt County territory altogether, taking a desk job at regional corporate management in Wichita. Back in Des Moines, the shift was even quieter. By the spring of 1995, the glossy comparison charts distributed across the High Plains underwent a silent corporate revision. The column titled Field Efficiency Rating, the very metric Whitfield had used to publicly criticize John Deere iron, was quietly scrubbed from all regional dealer materials. A product manager on the 3rd floor had concluded that the software assumptions used to generate those numbers were indefensible when tested against actual, unyielding farm conditions. No public statement was issued, and no letters were sent to the 31 farmers who had stood in Callaway's lot. The corporate machinery simply erased the metric and moved on. Raymond never knew about the paperwork change, and he wouldn't have cared if he had. He kept farming his 1,340 acres through the 1995 season without changing a single step of his routine. While neighboring operations wrestled with rising machinery debt and complex electronic glitches, the red Massey Ferguson 3690 quietly clocked hour after hour. The engine oil came out clean at every scheduled interval, the hydraulic pump maintained flat pressure under load, and the mechanical draft controls never misread a single foot of heavy soil. By the autumn of 1995, word-of-mouth reputation began to do what glossed promotional charts never could. In Ellis County, farmers didn't care about corporate press releases. They watched fence lines and noted which tractors were running when weather windows slammed shut. Neighbors stopped swinging by Raymond's shop just to lean against the fence and chat about weather or grain prices. Instead, they began asking if they could take a look at the dark gray filing cabinet in his shop office, wanting to examine the handwritten maintenance logs of a machine that had pulled 14 bottoms through 43 acres of hard pan without a single dollar spent on unscheduled repairs. The high timber cribbing of the Hayes grain elevator smelled of dry wheat dust, warm chain lube, and exhaust fumes. During the harvest seasons of 1995 and 1996, trucks sat idling in long lines waiting for the pit, their drivers leaning against hot tires to talk about fuel bills, interest rates, and equipment payments. In a county where a bad machinery investment could drain an operating line in 2 bad years, those conversations weren't idle chatter, they were economic intelligence. Raymond Dodd never volunteered his opinions from the scale house porch. He sat in the cab of his truck, stepping down only when a neighbor directly asked him about the red tractor. Over those 2 years, 3 different farmers facing equipment replacements came up to his running board. They didn't want sales talk or brand loyalty, they wanted the numbers. Raymond gave them exactly what was recorded in his ledger: fuel consumption per acre under heavy draft, exact fluid capacities, filter replacement costs, and 0 hours of unscheduled shop downtime across 5 seasons of hard work. When one young farmer asked if the 145 horsepower Perkins engine ever lacked torque against a 14-bottom moldboard, Raymond simply told him to check the field south of the section line, where 43 acres of hard pan had been prepped on schedule every single spring. He offered no criticism of Gary Whitfield's old chart, no harsh words about Callaway equipment, and no gossip about his neighbor Glenn's warranty visits. He provided raw operational facts, leaving the conclusions to men who had to sign their own checks. By the winter of 1997, the hour meter on the Massey Ferguson 3690 swept past 1,100 operating hours. The original paint was dulled by High Plains dust, and the exhaust stack carried a light patina of surface rust, but the engine block remained dry as bone, not a single oil weep from the head gasket or hydraulic seal. The machine had done precisely what Raymond had bought it to do: hold the line against bad weather and tight margins without failing when the window closed. One cold December evening, Raymond's 23-year-old son Marcus came home from Fort Hays State with his degree in agricultural business. He set his boots by the mudroom stove, walked into the kitchen, and laid a glossy sales brochure flat on the Formica table directly in front of his father. The kitchen table was littered with college notebooks, coffee mugs, and the glossy, full-color fold-out Marcus had brought home. The brochure featured a Massey Ferguson 6180, a modern 110-horsepower machine equipped with dynamic power shuttle control, an electronic draft sensing system, and an ergonomic cab built for long, precision fieldwork. Marcus leaned over the table, pointing to spec sheets with the sharp, eager focus of a young man who had just spent 2 years studying economic forecasting and agricultural technology at Fort Hays State. Marcus made his case calmly, respecting the discipline his father had instilled in him. He argued that while the 3690 was a masterwork of simple mechanical design, it was now 6 years old with 1,100 heavy draft hours on its frame. In Marcus's accounting, keeping a machine past its primary structural window meant gambling against fatigue failure, entering a gray zone where an unexpected pump fracture or internal gear shear could surprise them during a tight planting window. He presented a balance sheet showing how trading the 3690 while its resale value remained top tier across the county line would secure maximum trade credit, offsetting the note on a newer, more efficient unit. Raymond listened in silence, his large, scarred hands resting on either side of the brochure. He didn't dismiss the boy's words. Raymond knew that stubbornness masquerading as wisdom had ruined more than one High Plains farm when modern reality passed an old man by. He looked down at the margin of the notebook, where Marcus had neatly penciled out the math, financing terms from Frank Delmare at the Agco dealership in Great Bend, calculated over a 4-year term with a conservative interest rate. Raymond reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his worn lead pencil, and rechecked every single number on the page. He factored in crop forecasts, projected fuel costs, and trade-in valuations. The math was solid, practical, and grounded in the same financial discipline that had kept the farm afloat through the 90s. He looked at his son, seeing a partner who respected the land and the machinery, and nodded slowly. They would make the trade, not out of dissatisfaction but because managing iron meant knowing exactly when to step away before time made the choice for you. On a crisp February morning in 1998, the lowboy flatbed trailer from the Great Bend dealership backed into the Dodd yard. Raymond watched in quiet silence as the Massey Ferguson 3690 was backed up the steel ramps, its 6-cylinder Perkins turbo idling smooth and clean one final time. There were no emotional speeches and no dramatic farewells. The red paint was dulled by years of High Plains sun, and the rear tires showed the steady, honest wear of hundreds of acres turned under heavy draft, but every grease fitting was clear and every fluid reservoir was filled to the line. The tractor didn't go to a scrap heap or sit idle in a dealership lot. A grain producer 2 counties overbought the 3690 within 3 days of its arrival in Great Bend. Over the next 4 years, that machine worked another 900 hours without a single major mechanical failure, pulling deep tillage equipment through hard Kansas soil for a family that needed reliable iron just as badly as Raymond had. By the time word reached Ellis County that Gary Whitfield had taken a corporate management job in Wichita, the glossy white paper he had brought to the Dodd kitchen table had long since been recycled. The dynamic torque graphs and theoretical efficiency metrics had faded into irrelevance, while the work Raymond accomplished remained written directly into the soil. True value on the High Plains was never defined by sophisticated marketing campaigns, corporate guarantees, or theoretical calculations. It was measured in the quiet discipline of daily maintenance, the refusal to take on unnecessary debt, and the unyielding reliability of iron built to do an honest day's work. If you respect the history of heavy machinery and the hard-earned wisdom of the men who kept these classic tractors running through tight margins and tough seasons, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment below with your own stories of the reliable iron that built your farm, and share this video with someone who still values honest work over fancy sales talk.